May 28, 1940, Downing Street, London. Just after dusk, as the blackout curtains were drawn tight against the German bombers, Winston Churchill stood at the head of the War Cabinet table knowing that his name, his reputation, his entire life might soon be written into history as a failure. Only 18 days had passed since he became Prime Minister. France was collapsing. Belgium had surrendered. The British Expeditionary Force, nearly 340,000 men, was trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. Across the Channel, Adolf Hitler's armies moved with mechanical certainty. And inside Britain's own government, voices were rising that said the war was already lost. Churchill could hear them clearly. Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax spoke calmly, insistently, of exploring terms. He argued that Britain should use Mussolini as an intermediary, that some settlement, any settlement, might preserve the empire and spare the islands from annihilation. The cabinet listened. Some nodded. The logic was seductive. Survival now, judgment later. Churchill did not interrupt at first. He knew the arithmetic. Britain stood alone. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. The army's heavy equipment lay abandoned in France. If invasion came, it would come soon. And if it failed, there would be no second chance. He also knew something else. If he chose war and lost, history would not be kind. He would not be remembered as the defiant savior of Britain. He would be remembered as the man who refused peace and led his country to ruin. He said as much to those closest to him. In private, he acknowledged the possibility with brutal clarity. He told colleagues that posterity might judge him harshly, that future generations could say he had gambled recklessly with the fate of a nation, that his long career, marked already by Gallipoli, by political exile, by public ridicule, might end in final disgrace. Yet as the room pressed toward compromise, Churchill felt the weight of something heavier than reputation. He felt the permanence of surrender. Outside, London waited in silence. No cheers, no certainty. Only the knowledge that whatever decision was made in that room would shape not just the war, but the meaning of Britain itself. This was the moment, and it could not be undone. To understand the gravity of that evening in May, one had to understand the man standing alone against his own cabinet. Winston Churchill was 65 years old in 1940, an age when most political careers were winding down, not beginning anew. For decades, he had been a study in contradiction, brilliant, impulsive, arrogant, prescient, and frequently wrong. He had warned of German rearmament when others laughed. He had also engineered the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the previous war, a failure so profound it nearly destroyed him. That memory haunted him now. He knew what history did to men who gambled and lost. He had lived it. The war he now inherited was not of his choosing. Britain had declared war in September 1939, but had not truly prepared to fight it. The policy of appeasement, signed, sealed, and celebrated only 2 years earlier in Munich, had collapsed in disgrace. Neville Chamberlain was gone, and Churchill had been summoned not because he was loved, but because no one else remained. The situation in Europe was catastrophic. By May 1940, German forces had broken through the Ardennes in a maneuver most Allied commanders had considered impossible. In 10 days, the French front had disintegrated. Communications failed, command collapsed, entire divisions vanished. On May 24, as British troops retreated toward Dunkirk, the German panzers halted briefly, an order still debated by historians. That pause offered Britain a sliver of hope. But hope was not policy. It was not a strategy. Inside the War Cabinet, the question was brutally simple. Fight on alone or negotiate while there was still something left to negotiate with? Lord Halifax was not a coward. He was a realist, shaped by centuries of British diplomacy. He believed Britain's duty was to preserve itself, not to sacrifice the empire for a continent already lost. He spoke of reason, of leverage, of the possibility that Hitler, satisfied with dominance in Europe, might leave Britain untouched. Churchill listened and disagreed. He understood Hitler in a way others did not as a negotiator, but as a predator. Any peace offered now would be temporary, humiliating, and enforced by fear. Britain would exist, perhaps, but as a subordinate power, its independence slowly strangled. Still, dissent pressed in from all sides. The chiefs of staff were cautious, the dominions were anxious, Washington was silent. There would be no immediate American rescue. Churchill knew that if he chose defiance, he would stand utterly alone. And if it failed, the verdict would be final. The tension reached its breaking point on May 28, 1940. That morning, Churchill faced the full weight of opposition. Halifax returned to the argument for negotiation with renewed urgency. France was nearing capitulation. The British army was still pinned to the coast. Italy hovered on the brink of joining the war. Time, he warned, was not Britain's ally. The discussion circled the same terrible question. Could Britain survive a German invasion? No one in the room could answer with confidence. Churchill knew that logic alone would not win this battle. Numbers favored caution. Fear favored compromise. If the decision were reduced to military calculations, he would lose. So he did something extraordinary. He widened the room. At 4:30 p.m., he summoned the full cabinet, 25 ministers, many of whom had not been present for the earlier debates. Men responsible to Parliament, men who understood public sentiment, men who knew what surrender would mean to the streets of London, to the factories of Birmingham, to the docks of Liverpool. Churchill spoke without notes. He did not promise victory. He did not minimize danger. Instead, he spoke of choice, of national character, of the future Britain would inhabit if it bent the knee. He told them plainly that negotiation would not bring safety, that any terms would come with conditions: control of the fleet, occupation of key ports, and the slow erosion of sovereignty. Britain would not be destroyed in a single blow. It would be suffocated. Then he spoke the words he had been carrying since the debate began. If this island story were to end, he said, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. The room fell silent. This was not rhetoric for effect. It was a statement of consequence. He was telling them, and himself, that there would be no escape from responsibility, no middle path, no arrangement that preserved honor without risk. One by one, resistance collapsed. The ministers understood what was being asked of them. Not optimism, not bravado, but endurance. The willingness to be judged by history not on survival alone, but on defiance. When the meeting ended, the decision was clear. There would be no approach to Mussolini, no inquiry into terms. Britain would fight on, alone if necessary. Churchill returned to his office knowing that the die had been cast. If defeat came, it would bear his name. And he accepted that fully. The decision rippled outward immediately, though its consequences would not be felt all at once. That same night, as Churchill walked through the darkened corridors of Downing Street, reports from France grew worse by the hour. On May 29, the evacuation at Dunkirk began in earnest. Destroyers crossed the channel under constant air attack. Civilian vessels, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure craft were requisitioned in desperation. The operation was not a rescue, it was a gamble. Every hour mattered. Churchill followed the numbers obsessively. On the first day, barely 8,000 men were brought home. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. If the beaches fell, the British army would cease to exist as a fighting force. And still, the decision stood. There would be no appeal to Hitler's mercy, no back channel through Rome, no statement to the nation suggesting compromise. Instead, Churchill prepared the country for suffering. He revised his language carefully, stripping away any false comfort. When he addressed Parliament on June 4th, he did not speak of triumph. He spoke of endurance.
"We shall fight on the beaches," he said, listing the places where resistance would occur, one by one, as if engraving them into national memory. There was no promise of survival, only a refusal to submit. Behind the scenes, the cost of that refusal was already becoming clear. The Treasury warned of financial collapse if the war dragged on. The Admiralty calculated that the fleet could not replace its losses indefinitely. Intelligence reports suggested invasion plans, Operation Sea Lion, were being drafted in Berlin. Churchill read them all. He also read the private letters of colleagues who feared he had gone too far. Some worried Britain would be destroyed not by Germany, but by his obstinacy. Others wondered quietly whether Halifax had been right. Churchill did not argue with these doubts. In private, he admitted them. He confided to his doctor that he felt walking with destiny. Yet he understood what that meant. Destiny did not guarantee victory. It only guaranteed consequence. If the Luftwaffe crushed the RAF, if the Navy failed, if the invasion succeeded, there would be no one left to blame but him. History would not care about intentions. It would care about outcomes. By mid-June, France surrendered. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage where Germany had capitulated in 1918. Hitler ensured the symbolism was unmistakable. Europe lay under his control. Britain now stood entirely alone. In those weeks, Churchill's acceptance of possible failure hardened into resolve. He no longer spoke of how he would be remembered. He spoke only of what must be done. Radar stations were reinforced. Fighter command was prioritized. Coastal defenses were strengthened. Every decision carried the same underlying assumption. This would be fought to the end. There was no exit strategy, only survival or extinction. And Churchill had chosen which risk he was willing to bear. The reckoning came in the skies over southern England. From July to October 1940, the Battle of Britain unfolded as a sustained test of the decision made in that cabinet room weeks earlier. Day after day, German bombers crossed the channel in precise formations. Airfields burned, cities smoldered. Pilots were lost faster than they could be trained. At the height of the fighting, Fighter Command could spare barely 600 serviceable aircraft. There were moments, long, silent moments, when defeat seemed inevitable. Churchill visited air bases and watched exhausted men climb back into damaged machines. He studied casualty lists. He knew that if the RAF broke, invasion would follow. And with invasion would come the final judgment not only of the war, but of him. Yet the line held. Radar gave a warning. The Spitfires and Hurricanes returned again and again. German losses mounted. By September, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from airfields to cities, a strategic mistake born of frustration and pride. London burned, but Fighter Command survived. On September 15th, the largest air assault of the campaign was repelled. It was not celebrated as a victory at the time. It was recognized simply as survival. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The choice made in May had crossed a point of no return, and somehow it had not ended in ruin. Only then did history begin to soften. Churchill's words, once heavy with the possibility of failure, were now recast as prophecy. His refusal to negotiate became courage. His acceptance of condemnation became resolved. But that transformation came after the fact. It came only because the gamble succeeded. Had it failed, the same actions would have been judged as catastrophic arrogance. That is the truth Churchill himself understood from the beginning. He did not act because he knew he would be remembered well. He acted knowing he might not be, knowing that statues, speeches, and reverence were not guaranteed, knowing that history rewards success, not intention. What mattered in the end was that one man chose resistance when surrender was easier, rational, and widely supported. He accepted that his name might be synonymous with defeat, and decided that the risk was worth taking. In doing so, he marked the end of an era in British history, an era in which power was preserved through compromise and calculation. What followed was something harsher, more dangerous, and more defining, a nation betting its existence on refusal, and a leader who understood that some decisions cannot be made safely, only decisively.